Texas, summer 1889. The land is cracked open like something that gave up waiting for rain. Miles of it, brown and flat and merciless under a sky that hasn't blinked in 6 weeks. A town, small, tired, holding its breath. One building, the back of it, a kitchen door, barely lit. A woman stands in that doorway. Large hands, worn apron. The particular stillness of someone who has already made a decision and is simply waiting for her body to carry it out. She is holding the only food she has. Outside the light, a woman, a child, both of them very still. The boy's eyes go straight to what she's carrying, not to her face, to the food. She looks at him. Something moves across her expression, not grief, not hesitation, just the quiet, certain arithmetic of a woman who has already decided what matters most. She extends her arms. In the shadows behind her, a man she doesn't know is watching, and everything begins. The summer of 1889 arrived like blitzed. Not the dramatic kind. Not the kind with thunder and lightning and something worth telling your grandchildren about. Just the quiet, grinding kind. The kind where the creek drops an inch every week. Nobody has a word about it, because saying it out loud makes it more real. The kind where the dirt turns to powder under your boots, and the cattle stand in whatever shade they can find, and the whole county holds its breath, waiting for rain that doesn't come. The kind where a woman can disappear inside a kitchen for 10 years and nobody notices she's still there. Marin Callahan noticed everything. That was her particular burden and her particular skill. And most days she couldn't tell the difference between the two. She was up at 4, same as every morning, same as the morning before that and the 400 mornings before that. The Gideon's boarding house kitchen didn't care what time the sun rose. It didn't care that Marin's left boot had developed a crack along the sole that let in the cold floor every time she crossed to the stove. It didn't care that she hadn't eaten a full meal sitting down in 9 days. The kitchen just needed feeding, same as everything else Marin had ever known. She was 27 years old. She had started here at 17, the week after her father's cough finally won. Mrs. Gideon had needed someone who could lift a cast iron pot without flinching. Marin had needed rent money and a roof over her head. They had reached an understanding that neither of them ever discussed out loud again, because there was nothing left to say. Once the terms were clear. 10 years. 10 years of biscuits before sunrise. Coffee ready before the first boarder's boots hit the stairs. Moving through that dining room like something the furniture had always included. Present, necessary, invisible in the way that only truly useful things are invisible, so thoroughly relied upon that noticing becomes unnecessary. The regulars at Gideon's knew 3 things about Marin Callahan. The biscuits were always hot. The coffee never turned bitter. And if you left your plate with food on it, something was wrong with you, because nothing was ever wrong with the food. They knew those things the way they knew. The floor wouldn't give when they walked across it. You don't thank a floor. You just walk. What they did not know was this. Marin Callahan had a headache that had lived behind her left eye since Monday. She had split the back seam of her second-best apron and mended it 3 times that didn't quite match. She had a notebook in her apron pocket where she wrote down everything she observed about the people who ate her food. What they ordered without asking as king, what they pushed to the side of the plate, what they looked like when the food was right tent, and what they looked like when something at their table was wrong. Not because anyone had asked her to. Because paying attention was what she did with the hours she spent in rooms where nobody looked at her face. That particular Saturday evening, after the last boarder had pushed back from the table and the dining room had gone quiet, Marin did something she almost never permitted herself. She saved something for herself. It wasn't much. A handful of cornmeal she'd measured out careful before Mrs. Gideon counted the week's supplies. A scrape of lard wrapped in brown paper. Summer 1889. 2 pinches of salt. The land is cracked open kept back from the morning collection, waiting for rain, tucked into the pocket of her apron, brown where it flowed safe all day under a sky that hasn't blinked in 6 weeks. She'd been planning it since Tuesday, small, tired, holding onto the idea of it through the long scrubbing days the way a person barely holds onto something stands in that doorway, cold weather, large hands, not clutching it, worn apron, just aware of it. The particular that at the end of Saturday there already made the decision, one skillet of cornbread, waiting for her body to carry it out, not for a table, she is holding the only food, not for a paying guest, outside the light. For Marin Callahan, both of them who had been running on half a cold biscuit since noon, to what she's carrying, and could not remember the last time she'd made something with the specific intentions something eating it herself. Her expression. She mixed it by feel. Not hesitation. Her hands knew this recipe the way they knew certain arithmetic of a woman who has already decided what matters through years. Most. She extends her arms in the shadows of a woman who has done the same thing so many times that thinking is no longer part of the process. Just the hands moving, just the doing. The skillet went onto the stove. The smell came up slow and warm and golden, and Marin stood with her back to the flame and her eyes closed. That was the other thing Cornbread gave her. Not just food. 3 minutes of not thinking about anything at all. 3 minutes where the boarding house and Mrs. Gideon's instructions in the crack in her boot, and the 9 days without sitting down, all went somewhere else entirely. Somewhere quiet and without claim on her. When it came out golden at the edges and smelling like Sunday mornings, like something her mother used to make back in the years before everything shrank down to what it currently was. Marin set it on the cutting board and stood looking at it. She was going to eat it. Every bit. Standing right here in this kitchen, with no one watching and no one to serve, and it was going to be the best 3 minutes of the entire week. She picked up the skillet, carried it to the back door, opened the door. Dorothy Hatch was standing just outside the ring of light, the way she always stood when she came, right at the edge, where the dark part of the alley met the lit part, like she had calculated the exact point where she could be seen, without fully committing to being there, without fully admitting need. Her boy was pressed against her side, 6 years old, wearing a shirt that had been washed so many times it had forgotten its original color. His eyes went directly to the skillet, not to Marin, to the skillet, because children who have been hungry long enough stop looking at faces first. Dorothy opened her mouth, closed it, tried again. Marin, she said very carefully, "That's your supper." "It's cornbread," Marin said. "It'll go dry by morning." That was a lie. They both knew it. Fresh cornbread sealed properly will keep 2 days without trouble. But a lie that functions as kindness is a different animal entirely from a lie that functions as cruelty. And Dorothy Hatch was too tired and too hungry and too dignified to do anything except accept the gift that came wrapped in the small mercy of not having to be loudly grateful for it. She took the skillet with both hands. The boy looked up at Marin with eyes that were serious in the way children's eyes get serious when they've been taught that manners are the most valuable currency they have. "Thank you, ma'am," he said. "You eat every bit," Marin told him. "Don't you leave so much as a crumb." She went back inside, closed the door, stood in the dark kitchen with her hands pressed flat against the door frame, and listened to the sound of her own breathing. Still hungry, would be hungry until morning. She didn't think of what she'd just done as noble. She didn't think of it as sacrifice. It was a calculation, the only one she could live with. Watching a child go to bed without eating felt worse than her own empty stomach. That was all. Simple arithmetic, private arithmetic, hers. She did not know that someone was watching. Boone Mercer was not supposed to be in that alley. He was supposed to be halfway back to the hotel, finished with 3 days of bank meetings that had produced exactly the complications he'd feared, and not a single solution to match them. He'd stepped outside for a cigarette. Just 5 minutes. Just to stand somewhere dark and quiet and not be required to perform patience for another man in another office who kept using the word "unfortunately" as though it were punctuation. He was a man who needed that sometimes. The particular relief of not performing anything for anyone. He was 38 years old and built in the way of men who have worked land their whole lives rather than worked rooms. Broad through the shoulders, thick through the hands, with a face that the weather had done considerable work on over the years. People who didn't know him sometimes read that face as severity. They were wrong. He wasn't a severe man. He was a careful one. There is a difference, and most people never bother to learn it. He was standing at the corner of the livery stable, almost done with his cigarette, when the back door of Gideon's opened. He saw her, not first the skillet, first her, a large woman, broad-shouldered. Filling the doorframe was a person fills a space when they genuinely belong to it, not forcing the room to accommodate her, but simply occupying it with the particular ease of someone who has been competent in this specific place for a very long time. She moved through the door, with the skillet held in both hands and something in her face that he couldn't fully name from where he was standing. Not resignation, not contentment either. Something in between those two things that he didn't have a word for yet. He stayed still, watched her find the woman and the boy in the dark, watched her say something he couldn't hear, watched the boy reach for the skillet with the careful, serious hands. And then he watched Marin Callahan close the door. He stood in the alley for a while after that, longer than he meant to, thinking about the moment just before she handed it over. The way she'd stood holding the skillet, the set of her shoulders, the particular quality of a woman who has already made her decision and is simply completing the physical motion of carrying it out. She'd been hungry. He'd seen it in her face through the doorframe light, not performing hunger, not making a point of it, just actually hungry in the way of someone who has been running too long on too little. And she'd handed the food away anyway, not because anyone was watching, because of the boy's eyes. Boone dropped his cigarette into the dust, stepped on it, walked back to the hotel, lay on top of the covers in the dark for a long time, thinking about a woman in a kitchen doorway whose name he didn't know, making a decision she clearly didn't consider remarkable. For a child she had no obligation to feed. He thought about it until he fell asleep, and when he woke up, he was still thinking about it. He came back the next morning. He told himself it was because he hadn't eaten yet and Gideon's was closest, which was true, which was also, if he was being honest with himself, which he generally made a point of being, not the complete truth. The complete truth was that he wanted to see if she was real. Sometimes you see something in a particular light at a particular moment, and sleep rearranges it, makes it smaller, makes it ordinary, makes you understand you were reading significance into the routine action of a tired woman at the end of a long day. He wanted to know if that was what had happened. He sat at the table by the window. The girl who brought coffee was young and chatty, and asked whether he'd heard about the Dunmore family losing their well. He said he had. She refilled his cup without being asked. He thanked her. His attention was on the kitchen door. Marin came through it 20 minutes later, carrying a plate to the far table, moving exactly the way she'd moved in the alley, with the specific efficiency of someone who takes up less the task requires, and not 1 inch more. Not performing smallness, just operating at the frequencies of someone who has learned to exist in rooms without disturbing them. She set the plate down, said something brief to the man at that table that made him nod without looking up. Then she turned, and Boone said, "Excuse me." She stopped, turned to look at him with the pleasant expression of someone who has answered 1,000 variations of the same request and already knows which one is coming. More coffee, different eggs. A question about the bread. "Last night," Boone said, "the woman at the back door. That was your supper you gave her." The professional expression didn't change, but something behind it went very still. The particular stillness of a room where someone has quietly closed a door they didn't know was open. "I don't know what you mean," she said. "I think you do." A pause. She looked at him, actually looked. Not the quick functional assessment she gave most people who sat at her tables, a measuring look that took its time and didn't apologize for doing so. "The cornbread would have gone dry," she said finally. "You baked it that evening." "Yes." "So it wasn't going dry by morning." She said nothing. "Why did you do it?" he asked. "That's not your business." "No," Boone agreed. "It isn't. I'm asking anyway." Another pause. Longer. She was deciding something. He could see the process of it moving through her expression. Her boy hadn't eaten, Marin said. Flat, plain. The tone of a woman reciting an observable fact that required no declaration and no defense. That was reason enough. He looked at her for a long moment. Not the way men in this dining room typically looked at her. Not the cataloging look. Not the dismissive one. Not the look that arrives at its conclusion before it's even halfway through the looking. He looked at her the way a person looks when something has genuinely surprised them, and they want to understand it fully before they say a single word about it. "What's your name?" he asked. And that question, that simple ordinary question, was the thing that came closest to undoing her composure. 10 years. 10 years in this building, moving through these rooms, feeding these tables. She could count on one hand the number of regular guests who had thought to ask. "Marin," she said. "Marin Callahan, Boone Mercer." He extended his hand across the table, not as a gesture of anything unusual, just the way you extend a hand to any person who has told you their name and deserves the basic acknowledgement of the gesture. "Thank you for the coffee, Miss Callahan, and for breakfast. It's the best I've had in this town." She looked at his hand, then she shook it, went back through the kitchen door, stood on the other side with her palms pressed flat against the wood, the empty coffee cup still in her grip, listening to her own heartbeat. doing something she didn't have a name for yet. She told herself it was nothing. She told herself he was just a polite man passing through. The kind who didn't leave messes. The kind who said, please. The kind who left a fair tip and moved on, and that was the end of it. She thought about it for the rest of the week. Boone Mercer did not leave Harrow Creek the next day. He had legitimate reasons to stay. The bank complication involved a disputed survey on his eastern boundary, and a man named Silas Crane had filed paperwork that Boone's lawyer needed to review before anyone made a move. The lawyer was riding up from Abilene and wouldn't arrive before Thursday. Boone had no choice but to wait. He told himself that was why he came back to Gideon's on Monday. On Monday, Marin brought his coffee without being asked. She didn't linger. On Tuesday, he asked whether the eggs came from Gideon's own hens or the feed store. She said Gideon's hens. He said they tasted like it, which was a compliment, and she said she'd pass it along to the hens. He laughed. Not the polite kind, the real kind. The kind that rises up from somewhere without asking permission first. Marin felt it like a small, unexpected heat in the center of her chest, just to the left of the sternum, and she walked back into the kitchen and said out loud to nobody, "Stop that right now." The hens had no comment. On Wednesday, the dining room was nearly empty. Some town business about the water table had pulled most of the regulars away to the hall. Boone sat at his usual table alone. Marin brought out his food herself and was turning back when he said, "How long have you been cooking here?" She stopped. 10 years. Since you were 17, yes. Do you like it? The question landed strangely. Not because it was complex, because it was so simple that it had simply never come up before. Not once. Not in 10 years. "I like cooking," Marin said carefully. "Whether I like it here is a different question." Fair enough. He looked at his plate, then back at her. "Have you ever thought about doing something else?" "Every person who's cooked for other people's money has thought about doing something else," she said. "Thinking it and doing it aren't the same thing." "What would it take," he said, "for them to be the same thing?" She looked at him for a moment. "Why are you asking me these things?" "Because nobody else seems to be," Boone said. "Simple." The way he said it. Without performance. She stood in the empty dining room with the morning light coming in slow and sideways and felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. The particular sensation of being seen. Not looked at, not catalogued. Seen. It felt good. That was the problem. She had learned a long time ago not to trust things that felt good, because in her experience good things came with expiration dates she didn't get to set. "I should get back," she said. "Of course," he said. "Thank you, Miss Callahan." She got back. She scrubbed pans and worked bread dough and told herself firmly that Boone Mercer, a rancher with legitimate business in town, who would be gone by Friday, and that was the end of the story. She told herself this 7 more times over the next 2 days. She counted. He left on Friday, last supper at Gideon's. Marin came to clear the plates, and he said, heading back to the ranch in the morning. "Safe," she said. "Professional. Steady." "I have a problem," he said. She paused. "My housekeeper of 12 years retired last month. Her brother is ill out into Mexico, and she's gone to be with him, and I don't know when or if she's coming back. I have 7 working hands, a foreman, 2 seasonal workers coming through the fall. Nobody running the kitchen or the household. Things have been," he stopped, reconsidered the word he'd been about to use. "Unmanaged." Marin waited. "I'd like to offer you a contract," he said. 6 weeks to start. A fair wage, better than what you're earning here. Full authority over the kitchen and household management. Written terms, whatever conditions you'd feel right about it. She stared at him. "You don't know me," she said. "I know enough," Boone said. "You know I bake cornbread and give it away. I know you've been running this kitchen by yourself for 10 years while Mrs. Gideon's take the credit for it," he said. "I know you remember every order at every table without writing a single thing down. I know the biscuits here are gotten every year you've been here, and not one person in this room has thought to mention it." He looked at her, not performing, just saying what he'd observed. "I've been paying attention, Miss Callahan, since Monday." The dining room was quiet around them. "I have conditions," she said. "Name them. Wages in writing before I agree to anything." "Done. Full authority over the kitchen. Not suggestions, not approval required. Full authority. Agreed. If the arrangement doesn't suit either of us after 6 weeks, I leave with my full pay and no further obligation." Of course, she was quiet, running through the list of reasons to say no, which was long and well rehearsed, running through the list of reasons to say yes, which was shorter but had a different kind of weight to it. Why me, she said. Truly, there are women in Harrow Creek who need work. Women whose presence at your table would give your hands fewer opinions to share. Boone looked at her steadily. I don't run my ranch based on what produces fewer opinions, he said. I run it based on what works. I believe you work, Miss Callahan. I believe you're the most capable person I've encountered in this town, and I believe you've spent 10 years demonstrating that to people who weren't paying attention. A pause. I'm paying attention. Maran stood in the dining room of Gideon's boarding house and felt the familiar warning move through her chest. The one that said don't. The one that said, you know how this goes. The one that had been right before and was perhaps right now and perhaps wasn't, and she couldn't tell which. I'll give you my answer in the morning, she said. She gave him her answer at sunrise. Standing on the back step of Gideon's with the pale at his horizon, and the air still carrying the night's slight coolness before the heat settled in for the day. Yes, she said, one word. But her voice didn't waver saying it. She packed in 20 minutes. Everything she owned fit in one bag. That had always been true. She had stopped being troubled by it a long time ago, or had told herself she had, which wasn't exactly the same thing, but functioned similarly in daily life. She stood in the small she'd slept in for 10 years. The room that carried to the smell of the kitchen, even when she wasn't in it. The room that was precisely the size of a life built around making yourself as small as possible so that no one would need to rearrange themselves to accommodate you. She picked up the bag, walked out, did not look back. Not because she wasn't tempted. Because she had made a decision and looking backward was not part of how she moved forward. The wagon seat was harder than she'd expected. The road northwest was packed dirt and old ruts and whatever 6 weeks of drought had done to both. Marin sat with her bag and her back straight and watched the town pull away behind her without ceremony. Boone rode alongside on a dark bay horse, big animal, built for work, not for show, like the man himself. He didn't attempt conversation for the first hour. Marin appreciated this more than she could have said. 10 years, surrounded by noise that had nothing to do with her, had made her acutely aware of the difference between silence that's offered and silence that's simply the absence of anything better. This was the offered kind. She settled into it the way you settle into a chair that fits. Somewhere past the first hour, he rode a little closer and said, without preamble, the foreman's name is Chester Wold. He's been at the ranch for 15 years, knew my father before me. He's good at what he does. But, Marin said. Boone glanced at her sideways. He has opinions that were formed a long time ago and don't always make room for new circumstances. You're telling me he's going to make my first week difficult. I'm saying he might. Marin looked out at the flat brown land spreading away in every direction. The heat-bleached grass, the enormous shade-free distance. Mr. Mercer, she said, I have spent my entire working life in spaces that belong to other people. I know exactly what it looks like when a man has decided, before I walk through the door, that I don't belong there. I know how to manage it. I don't doubt you, Boone said. I thought you deserved the warning. I appreciate it, she said. And she did. Not because the warning changed what was coming, because giving it revealed something about who he was. They rode in silence for a while. Then Marin opened her notebook and wrote the number 9 at the top of a clean page. Boone asked. 7 hands, a foreman, 2 seasonal workers, she said. 9 people to feed, plus you. 10. She wrote 10 and underlined it. Are there any food intolerances I should know about? Medical conditions? Anything that makes a person ill? The expression on his face told her this question had not previously occurred to him, which told her everything she needed to know about the state of his kitchen for the past month. Not that I know of, he said. I'll find out myself then, Marin said. She closed the notebook. Boone watched her do it. Mercer Ranch came into view in stages. First the fence line, stretching in both directions farther than she could see. Then the smell of cattle and dry grass and worked leather. The specific combination that meant a real operation, not a decorative one. Then the cattle themselves, lean but standing, which, in a drought year, meant someone had been paying attention to the right things. The ranch house was large and plain. Practical additions made over decades rather than a single planned structure, with a deep porch running the front and a kitchen wing extending off the back. Marin's gaze went to the kitchen wing first. It always did. Chester Wold was on the porch, in late 50s, broad through the chest. The kind of weather that comes from 3 decades of outdoor work and gradually stops being an appearance and becomes simply what a face is. He had the particular stillness of a man who watches things and forms conclusions about them and has been doing both long enough that the watching and the concluding have become one motion. The moment Marin stepped down from the wagon, she felt that stillness focus on her. He looked at her, then at Boone. "This the new cook?" he said. "This is Marin Callahan," Boone said. "She'll be managing the household and the kitchen." Chester looked at Marin again, the expression of a man recalculating how much difficulty a new situation was going to cost him. "Ma'am," he said, "no warmth in it, just the word, Mr. Wold." Marin said it pleasantly. "I understand you've kept things running since the housekeeper left. I appreciate that. I'd like to hear about the routine you've been keeping so I know where to begin." Chester's expression shifted by a fraction. That was not what he'd expected her to say. "Breakfast at 5:30, he said after a moment. "Dinner at noon. Supper when the work's done, 7 or 8, depending. What have the men been eating this past month? What they could put together." Marin wrote something in her notebook. "I'll need to see the pantry before I plan anything. And is there a kitchen garden?" Chester blinked. "Was one. Nobody's tended it since the housekeeper left." "I'll look at it first thing tomorrow," Marin said. "Thank you, Mr. Wold. That's genuinely helpful." She picked up her bag and walked past him into the house. Chester stood on the porch and watched her go. Something moved through his expression. Not anything he could have named if asked, but not what had been there when she arrived. The kitchen was a working kitchen that had been without stewardship for a month. Not filthy, but the kind of disorder that accumulates when a space has multiple people and no single person accountable for it. Pots stacked the wrong way, the flour bin left open, a sack of onions gone soft in the corner, a skillet on the back of the stove with old grease that had long since turned. Marin stood in the middle of it, turned a slow circle, felt something settle in her chest. Not happiness exactly. Something quieter and more durable than happiness. The particular sense of purpose that comes when the work is clear, and the hands know what to do next, and there's nothing to do but begin. She set down her bag, tied on her apron, got to work. By the time the the kitchen smelled like something none of them had encountered in a month. Another smell of whatever food had been assembled by tired, untrained hands. Something made with intention. Beef and onion stew. Biscuits that had actually risen. Coffee that was hot and strong without having been destroyed by an open flame and inattention. The table went quiet when the food arrived. Not the polite quiet of people searching for something to say. The real quiet of people who are tasting something and have stopped needing to do anything else while they do it. Clem Darrow, youngest at the table, 20 years old, was everywhere, looked up from his bowl with the expression of a person who has received information they weren't prepared for. "Ma'am," he said, "this is the best thing I've eaten since February." "Thank you," Marin said from the stove. "What did you do to it?" he asked. She heard the genuine curiosity in it. "Cook the onions low and slow instead of just getting them hot," she said, "and I used pepper." Clem looked at his bowl as though it had just made a confession. Chester Wold, at the far end of the table, said nothing at all. He ate 2 full bowls of the stew and a biscuit and a half. Marin noted this without comment. Boone caught her eye from across the table. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite as a smile, but in the same neighborhood as one. She looked away first. Later, after the bunkhouse had gone dark and the house had settled into its nighttime sounds, Marin sat at the kitchen table with her notebook open. She wrote every name. Clem Darrow ate fast and too much. He'd need something mid-morning or he'd be hollow by 11. Ezra Hollis, the older hand with the careful right arm, ate slowly, worked left-handed, almost certainly carrying an old injury that had changed how he moved through everything. 2 of the seasonal's men had scraped their bowls, between bowls the way mimed when they've been running short for weeks. She wrote it all down. Then she opened to a clean page and wrote, "Day 1. Underneath that, they didn't ask my name." She looked at that line, wrote beneath it, "But they ate 2 bowls." She closed the notebook, blew out the lamp, stood in the dark kitchen that wasn't yet hers but might become so, that she had cleaned and organized and fed in the space of a single afternoon, and looked out the window at the enormous Texas night. Not full of stars tonight, heavy with cloud cover that hadn't brought rain and probably wouldn't. the heat still present even now, the drought patient and ongoing. Marin Callahan stood in the dark and thought about a skillet of cornbread, a boy's careful hands, and a man who had come back in the morning and asked that 10 years of daily service had not once produced. She thought about the list of reasons not to trust any of this. Long list, well-maintained. But somewhere between the rancid skillet she'd scoured clean and the two bowls Chester Wold had eaten without acknowledging, and the way Boone Mercer's expression had moved at the corner of his mouth without quite becoming a smile, maybe the list was not the whole story. She untied her apron, folded it over the chair. Tomorrow she would find out what was left of the kitchen garden, and Schützstitsrufosir. The second week began with a number Marin didn't like. She'd done the pantry count the night before. After supper, after the dishes, after everyone had gone to their bunks and the house had gone quiet. She'd moved through every shelf with a lamp in one hand and her notebook in the other, writing down every item, every quantity, every that was less full than it should have, and every one that was empty when it shouldn't be. The number at the bottom of the last page was 18. 18 days of supplies at current household size. After that, the shelves would tell the truth plainly, and there would be nothing to soften it. She sat with the number for a while, not in the panicked way. Panic is what happens when you haven't decided yet what to do about a problem. Marin had already decided before she closed the notebook. She just needed Boone to sit down long enough to hear her out. He came through the kitchen at 5 in the morning, earlier than she'd expected, still working the buttons on his work vest, boots the specific yet fully laced. The specific appearance of a man who has been awake for an hour already, lying in the dark turning over problems that don't resolve themselves by lying in the dark turning them over. He stopped when he saw her at the table, the notebook, the 3 columns of numbers. "You're up early," he said. "I'm always up early," Marin said. "Sit down. I need to talk to you about the food budget." He sat. No argument, no delay. She pushed the notebook across without preamble and explained the numbers plainly. The drought had pushed prices at the Harrow Creek General Store up like from last year. The monthly household allotment Boone had set before the housekeeper left would cover the basics and nothing else. 86 cents of current supplies meant that by the end of the month, she'd be improvising with whatever she could stretch. "I have 3 proposals," she said, "if you're willing to hear them." "Go ahead. The kitchen garden first." She'd walked it at first light 2 mornings ago, on her knees in the cracked dirt with her hands in the soil testing what was still alive. The tomato roots were holding. 2 rows of pole beans that looked dead on top but weren't. Something that might be squash if it got consistent water for 3 weeks. Not a lost cause, just a neglected one. "With the right attention every morning," she said, "we have fresh vegetables by end of August. That cuts the produce cost significantly and gives the men something green, which they haven't had in a while, and which matters more than most people acknowledge." She turned the page. "Second, there are working households within 10 miles of this ranch. I want to reach out directly, cook to cook, nothing formal, no ledgers, about trading surplus. Every kitchen in a drought year is sitting on too much of one thing and short on another. A trade arrangement costs nothing and stretches every pantry involved." Boone was listening the way he listened to everything, completely still. The kind of attention that doesn't leak anywhere. "Third," Marin said, "waste. In the month without a housekeeper, this kitchen has been losing close to a third of what comes in, to spoilage, to misuse, to men helping themselves at odd hours and leaving bins open. I can cut that loss to almost nothing in 2 weeks. How? By being the only person who decides how things in this kitchen are used," she said. "Plainly, without apology, I'll feed everyone properly. 3 meals, right portions, nobody goes short. But the kitchen is mine, not a suggestion. Full authority the way the contract says." A pause. "Done," Boone said. She'd expected negotiation, some form of it. The absence was almost disorienting. "I'll need you to make that clear to Chester," she said. "It'll carry more weight coming from you. I'll speak to him this morning." She nodded, reached across and took the notebook back. Then, more quietly, "You didn't know the supply situation was this bad when you hired me." "No," he admitted. "I'm not raising it as a complaint. I'm raising it because I need honesty from you about what's actually happening on this ranch. I can't plan around things I don't know about." Boone looked at her across the table. Outside the kitchen window, the first gray light of morning was pressing itself against the glass. Not dawn yet, just the suggestion of it. The hour that belongs to people who are up before the day has committed to anything. Fair, he said. A pause. Then the bank meeting in Harrow Creek. The complication I mentioned when I came back to Gideon's. The land survey. A man named Silas Crane bought the property bordering my eastern boundary last year. He's filed a claim on the water rights to the creek that runs along that edge of the ranch. His lawyer says a survey from 20 years ago was miscalculated, and the creek belongs to Crane's land, not mine. Boone's voice stayed level, the levelness of a man who has been practicing that particular control. If he wins, I lose the only reliable water source for the eastern pasture. As Marin was quiet for a moment, how likely is he to win? My lawyer puts it at 40%. 60% you keep it then. 40% is not nothing. No, Marin said, it isn't. She wrote something in the notebook, turned the page. Then we run this kitchen as though the 40% has already happened. If it turns out we planned for worse than what comes, we've saved money we didn't expect to keep. It's not a bad outcome. Boone looked at the woman sitting across his kitchen table in the gray pre-dawn, with her columns of numbers and her undecorated way of meeting difficult facts head-on, and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. The specific relief of being in the company of someone who was thinking clearly and didn't need him to manage them while they did it. I'll speak to Chester, he said. He stood, picked up his coffee. Marin. She looked up from the notebook. Thank you, he said. Simply. Then he walked out. She kept writing. The conversation with Chester Wool did not go smoothly. Marin heard most of it through the kitchen window, which faced the porch and which she had propped open at dawn, because the kitchen was already hot and would get hotter. She wasn't trying to listen, but some things carry whether you want them to or not. Boone's voice was steady and deliberate. Chester's was the voice of a man working to keep his objections within the boundary of professional respect and finding it an effort. She's been here 8 days, Chester said, and in those 8 days the kitchen is cleaner, the food is better, and she's identified a supply problem that's been sitting there for a month, Boone said. What's your objection, Chester? The men won't take to being directed by someone they don't know. They took direction from you once. How long did that require? Silence. It's not just cook, Chester said, arriving finally at the real point. Household management. That puts her above me in the house. In household matters, your authority over the ranch operation doesn't change by a single inch. Chester stopped. Finish that with care, Boone said. Another silence, longer this time. She doesn't know this ranch, Chester said at last. She'll learn it. Give her a fair chance, that's what I'm asking, nothing more. Marin stepped back from the window. She had heard enough. She knew that conversation had been the subject of some version of it for her entire working life. The argument about whether she deserved to be somewhere, conducted by people who had settled on their answer before she arrived, before she said a word, before she did a single thing. She had long since stopped expecting people to skip it. The work was her argument. It always had been. So she went back to the work. That morning she went to the bunkhouse. She knocked on the open door frame and said clearly enough to Carrie, I have 2 quick questions for anyone who's willing. 3 heads came up. Clem Darrow leaning against his bunk pulling on a boot. Ezra Hollis seated at the small table near the window with a mug of something, moving carefully as he always moved. His right side always just slightly held back from full use. Frank Birch, a weathered man of about 45 who'd been at the ranch 6 years and wore the permanent expression of a man braced for mild disappointment. Food questions, Marin said before anyone could ask. Is there anything any of you can't eat? Anything that makes you ill? Frank stared at her. You're asking what we don't like. I'm asking what will make you sick, Marin said. Profens I accommodate when I'm able. Medical needs I accommodate always. A pause. Clem can't do dairy, Frank said slowly, with the air of a man not entirely sure why he was answering, but answering anyway. Gets him in real trouble. I noticed he skipped the gravy 2 nights running, Marin said. I'll keep it in mind. She waited until all 3 of them were looking at her. Second question, what did the last housekeeper make that you miss most? The silence that followed was different from the first one. Softer. The slightly startled quiet of men who've been asked something personal in a work context and aren't quite sure what to do with the fact that someone thought to ask. Ezra Hollis said, without looking up from his mug, she made a bean soup on Sundays, ham bone and dried sage. I'll see what I can do before the end of the week, Marin said. Thank you, gentlemen. That's everything. She walked back to the kitchen, wrote in her notebook, bean soup, Sunday, ham bone, sage. When Clem appeared at the kitchen in Norway at 10:45 with the specific expression of a man whose body has begun lodging a formal complaint, Marin was already at the stove. She held out a biscuit with salt pork without turning around. He stopped mid-step. How did you? You ate too fast at breakfast and didn't leave enough room, she said. You'll hold until noon. Clem took the biscuit, stood in the doorway for a moment with the look of someone encountering a thing they have no existing category for. Then he walked out without another word. Marin allowed herself precisely 3 seconds of quiet satisfaction. Then she went back to the stove. On the 4th day, Chester Wold walked into the kitchen while Marin was midway through dinner preparation and said, without greeting, "We've got a problem." She didn't stop stirring. What kind? Supply order from town. The one I put in 3 weeks ago, it's come back short. Merchants says drought pricing and low stock. He can only fill half the flour order. Dried beans are gone completely. Marin set down the spoon, turned around. Chester was standing in the kitchen doorway with his hat held in both hands. And on his face, an expression she hadn't seen there yet. Not the guarded assessment of their first days. Something more like the look of a man who has come at the person because he's run through the other options, and this is what's left. Short, she said. Half the flour. No beans at all. Sugar and coffee came through fine. When does it arrive? Day after tomorrow. Marin turned back to the stove. 30 seconds of silent calculation. Then she started talking at a pace that didn't invite interruption. I need you to ride to the Dunbar place before dark. Tell Mrs. Dunbar that Marin Callahan at Mercer Ranch is proposing a trade. She has surplus cornmeal. I saw 3 unopened sacks stacked in the outbuilding when we passed on the road in. We have extra salt pork from last month's delivery. 2 pounds of salt pork for 1 sack of cornmeal. That's a fair exchange in drought conditions, and she'll know it. Chester stared at her. You want me to ride 6 miles to negotiate a food trade? I want you to ride 6 miles so that when the offer arrives, it's taken seriously today, instead of sitting on a note for 3 days, Marin said. Need that cornmeal before the short order comes in, so the men don't notice a difference in what's on the table. If they notice, morale dips. If morale dips during cattle work, mistakes happen. This is not a small thing. Chester was quiet. He turned his hat once in his hands. Twice, you planned for this, he said. Not quite an accusation, not quite recognition. Something between. I planned for the possibility, Marin said. I'd rather have the plan and not need it. Another silence. Then Chester put his hat back on his head. Dunbar's is 6 miles, he said. I know, Marin said. Thank you, Mr. Wold. He walked out without another word. Marin turned back to the stove and did not allow herself to wonder whether he'd go. She had dinner to finish, and thinking about things outside her control was a habit she had broken a long time ago. He came back at dusk, 1 sack of cornmeal, and unexpectedly, a bundle of dried sage from Mrs. Dunbar's kitchen garden, sent with the message she'd heard there, was finally someone who knew what they were doing in the Mercer kitchen, and she hoped the woman was being treated right. Marin took the cornmeal and the sage, set them on the table. Thank you, Mr. Wold, she said, genuinely. Chester set down his hat beside the items. His expression had moved again in that slow, effortful direction it had been moving since the first day. Mrs. Dunbar says if you want to make it a regular arrangement, she's open to it. She's got more sage than she can use, and she's short on salt pork. Tell her yes, Marin said. And tell her Sunday bean soup will be back on this table by the weekend. She's welcome to the recipe if she wants it. Chester looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded, not the minimal, managed nod of his first week. Something more deliberate. In the particular language of men like Chester Wold, it was as close to "I had you wrong" as he was likely to get out loud. Supper smells good, he said. 20 minutes, Marin said. He walked out. She stood in the kitchen and took 1 slow, full breath. Just 1. Then went back to work. Sunday bean soup came out right. Ham bone that Boone produced from somewhere without comment, like a man who had been paying quiet attention to conversations he wasn't supposed to have overheard. Sage from Mrs. Dunbar's garden. Dried beans soaked overnight because Marin had no patience for shortcuts that ended up in the taste. When she set the pot on the table that Sunday noon, Ezra Hollis went still. He looked at it for a long moment without speaking. Then, very quietly, The old housekeeper would have liked you, Marin said. That might be the kindest thing anyone said to me in a good long while. Ezra looked up. His eyes had the quality of someone who had seen a great deal and stopped being surprised by most of it, but had not stopped noticing. Then people haven't been looking at you properly, he said. Something tightened briefly in Marin's throat. She picked up the ladle and started filling bowls. On the 9th day, the legal document arrived. A rider from Harrow Creek handed the envelope to Boone at the front gate and turned back toward town before anyone thought to ask him anything. Marin was in the kitchen when Boone came through the door. She knew from the set of his shoulders before he opened it. She had been learning to read him faster than she expected to. The way his jaw went tight when something genuinely troubled him. The way stillness in him meant something different from stillness in other men. Other men went still when they had nothing to say. Boone went still when he was working through something too serious to speak about until he understood it fully. He read the document once, set it on the kitchen table without comment. Marin dried her hands and picked it up. The legal language was dense, but the substance was plain enough. Silas Crane had filed for an emergency injunction on the Eastern water rights, citing survey evidence his lawyer claimed had been overlooked in the original boundary work 2 decades prior. The injunction didn't settle the dispute. That would take months in court, but it placed an immediate restriction on Mercer's use of the Eastern Creek while the case was pending. Effective in 14 days. She set it down. How many head depend on that creek, she said. All of the eastern pasture. 280 head, and the western wells won't carry that volume. Not in a drought year. Not even close. So you move them west. They crowd. They lose weight before October market. She was thinking out loud. Laying it out. How much does that cost you in real terms? Enough to make this a hard year. If Crane wins the full case, it becomes 2 hard years in a row. Marin looked at the document again. He's not trying to win the water rights, she said. Boone looked at her sharply. What do you mean? A man doesn't file emergency gas injunctions, he's ignored for a full year, she said. He files them when he wants leverage for something else. When did Crane first approach you about the eastern acreage? A pause. 6 months ago, through his lawyer, and you declined, I declined, so the injunction is pressure, Marin said. He's not trying to win. He's trying to make your operation expensive enough that selling looks like relief. Boone looked at her with the particular expression she'd begun to recognize, the one that arrived when she'd followed a line of reasoning to the same place he'd already reached, but by a different path. My lawyer said the same thing this morning, he said. Then your lawyer is thinking clearly, she said. Don't negotiate. Don't give him a single signal that you're weighing the option. The moment you engage with pressure as though it's a legitimate offer, you've already conceded something. She picked the document up again. Read it through once more. 14 days before the restriction takes effect. What does the cattle movement require day by day? He told her, the sequence of it. Which pastures, which water points, how many men on which days, the western well situation that would need shoring up before the herd arrived. Tell me the full schedule, Marin said. Her notebook was already open. He looked at her. Why? 14 days of hard work in August heat means 14 days of men burning through more fuel than usual, she said. I need to plan around the physical demand. Moving cattle in drought conditions with men who aren't eating enough is how you get injuries. That's your problem to solve outside. The kitchen is mine to solve in here. Boone sat down across from her at the kitchen table and told her the full 14-day plan. She wrote it all down, asked precise questions about timing and which men would be on the heaviest shifts. And by the time they were done, the coffee had gone cold, and Boone was looking at the schedule on the page with the expression has been something alone and has just had half the weight lifted by someone who knew exactly where to put their hands. Marin, he said. She was already closing the notebook. You didn't have to do this. This ranch is what I came to work for, she said simply. What happens here is my concern. She said it plainly, the way she said everything true, without decoration, without asking for a response. But Boone held on to it after she turned back to the stove. Turned it over quietly in his mind, the way you turn over a thing you want to be sure you understand completely before you set it down. The 14 days moved like a river in flood, fast, relentless, carrying everything. Marin got up at 3:30 every morning to have the first meal ready before the earliest riders went out. She made food that traveled: biscuits wrapped tight in cloth, hard-boiled eggs, dense cornmeal cakes that could be eaten in the saddle because some of the men didn't make it back at noon. Coffee was ready at every return, hot without fail. At supper, she made the kind of food that required nothing from the eater except willingness to sit down. Things that were hot and filling and asked no questions of a man who had nothing left to give after 12 hours of hard work in August heat. On the 5th day of the cattle move, Clem came in with his left hand wrapped in a cloth soaked through red. Marin had him at the table, and the wound cleaned and dressed before Chester finished explaining what had happened. Sent through the whole process, watching her hands work with the expression of someone who expects pain and is genuinely confused by its absence. "That wasn't as bad as I expected," he said. "You're running on adrenaline," Marin said. "It'll find you later. Don't use that hand tomorrow. I've got to work tomorrow." "You can work," Marin said. "You just can't use that hand. Tell me what jobs can be done with one hand functioning, and I'll talk to Chester about the assignment." Clem blinked. "You're going to negotiate my duties. I'm going to make sure you don't tear that wound open and lose permanent function in your hand because someone put you on the wrong job the day after you got hurt," Marin said. "Yes." Chester, standing in the kitchen doorway, said nothing. The following morning, Clem was at the gate work. Chester made the call. He did not mention Marin. Marin did not mention it either. On the 9th day of the move, the argument started at the supper table. Two of the seasonal hands, Garrett, who'd been brought in from the north, and a man named Slocum, who worked for 3 seasons in the county and had a history with Garrett that predated Mercer Ranch, had been circling something for days. The immediate trigger was a supper portion. The actual cause was 9 days of brutal work in close quarters with no end clearly in sight, and the particular combustibility of men who are exhausted and can't direct that feeling anywhere useful. Marin heard the voices rise in the dining room. She listened for 3 seconds, enough to understand the shape of it. Then she walked through the door, with the pot still in her hand. "Sit down," she said. Both men looked at her. Neither moved. "I'm not asking," Marin said. The specific quiet of someone for whom the statement is simply a fact. They sat. She looked at Garrett, looked at Slocum, set the pot on the table between them. "I have fed this table twice today," she said. "I will feed it again tomorrow and every day this work requires. Nobody here has gone short. If you believe you have, you come to me, and I will personally put more food in front of you. What I will not do is stand in this kitchen and listen to grown men fight over a table because they're tired and miserable and don't have another place to put it." Pause. "Is there something either of you actually needs?" Silence. Garrett said, in a smaller voice than he'd been using, "It's been 9 days. "I know," Marin said. "I've been here for every one of them." Slocum stared at the table. "How much longer?" 5 more days of moving. Then the work changes." She refilled both their bowls, without being asked, and without making anything of it. Neither man said another word that evening, and not for the remainder of the cattle move. Chester found her at the sink afterward. He stood in the doorway for a moment before he spoke. "Where'd you learn to do that?" "Do what?" "Stop something like that without raising your voice." 10 years in a boarding house dining room," Marin said. "You learn to read a room before it tips, or you spend all your time cleaning up after it does." She rinsed the bowl in her hands, turned around. "Was there something you needed, Mr. Wold?" Chester was looking at her with the expression that had been traveling its slow, effortful distance since the cornmeal run to Dunbar's. "I wanted to say that was well done," he said. "Thank you." He started to turn, stopped. "The men have been talking about you," he said. Without looking at her, Marin waited. "Not the way they were talking when you first arrived," he said. "Some of them had opinions then. Those opinions have changed." She said nothing. "I thought you should know," Chester said, and walked out. Marin stood in the kitchen and let herself hold that for a moment, the small, hard-won weight of it. Then she went back to the dishes. The fire came on the 12th day of the cattle move. Southeast wind. Dry and building since early afternoon in the particular way that people who have lived their lives in dry country learn to recognize before they can fully explain why. A quality to the air, a specific edge. Marin smelled it from the kitchen garden. She'd been checking the tomato plants, which had put out small, firm, green fruit in the past week, despite the cracked soil, despite the heat, against every reasonable expectation. when the sharpness hit her. She straightened, turned south. Her stomach dropped before her mind finished identifying what the smell meant. By the time she reached the front of the house, the smoke was already visible. A column of it, thick and dark, rising from the southeast, where the dry grass stretched for miles without interruption. And there was nothing to stop what was coming. The ranch broke into motion. Boone on horseback before Marin had crossed the yard. Chester directing the hands toward the water wagons. The organized urgency of people who know their roles and are moving into them as fast as their bodies allow. Marin went back to the kitchen. Not because she wasn't afraid. She was afraid with the clarity that moved through her, clean and cold, the specific fear of someone who understands exactly what a fire means in a drought year on land that hasn't had rain in 6 weeks. She understood it completely. But she also understood exactly what her part in the next several hours required. And standing in the yard was not it. She got every burner going. She pulled every clean cloth she owned, dishcloths, flour sacks, the spare linens from the back shelf, and cut them into strips and soaked them in the water reserve. She dragged both large washtubs from the back porch and filled them. She started the strongest coffee she could make and had cornbread batter ready to go into the oven the moment she's had space. Frank Birch came through the door 40 minutes later, with burns running up both forearms and a face that had gone gray under the soot. "Sit," Marin said. He sat. She was at the burns with the cool, wet cloth before he'd finished lowering himself. "How bad is it out there?" she said, working steadily, not stopping. "2 outbuildings on the south line," Frank said. His voice had the particular steadiness of someone expending effort to maintain it. "Fires past the eastern pasture now. They got the herd pushed west before it reached. Lost a fence line, maybe 2, he hissed sharply. "Keep talking," Marin said. "It helps. Boone's riding the south line with Chester." He paused. Clem got turned around in the smoke. Ezra went after him. Marin's hands didn't stop moving. "How long ago?" 20 minutes, maybe more." She finished wrapping Frank's arms, pressed water into his hands, went to the bow and looked out at the orange edge, pressing through the haze on the horizon. Felt the fear move through her again, differently this time. Specific, directed. Clem was 20 years old and had been with the ranch 3 months. Ezra was 61 with a right arm that didn't work at full capacity. She went back inside. For the next 4 hours, men came through the kitchen in waves. Burned, smoke blackened, shaking with the particular tremor that comes after adrenaline has burned through and left nothing behind it. Marin worked without pause. She dressed burns. She pressed water coffee into hands that were too exhausted to ask for them. She listened to a fragment of information each man carried in and built from the fragments a picture of what was happening outside. Which buildings had been lost, which fire lines had held, where the herd had ended up, where Clem was. When Ezra came through the back door with Clem's arm across his shoulders, Marin crossed the kitchen in 6 steps. She got her arm under Clem's other side, got him into a chair. He was unburned, but he'd taken in too much smoke, coughing in the deep, painful way that meant his lungs were fighting it. Eyes streaming and unfocused, hands shaking against his legs. "Clem," Marin said, clearly. She put herself in his line of sight. "Look at me." He looked at her. "You're in the kitchen. The fire is past. You're all right." Small movement, hands still shaking. "Drink this." She pressed water into his grip, wrapped both his hands around the cup. Slow, small sips. She kept her hand on his back. Steady pressure, and the shaking began to ease. Ezra sat across from him, soot covered from his hat down. Marin poured coffee and set it in front of him without a word. He accepted it the same way. The 3 of them were simply still for a moment, in the middle of all of it. That was enough. Boone came in at 10 o'clock. Through the back door the way he always came when he'd been working. No announcement, just presence. He stopped inside the doorway, took in the kitchen, the cloth strips laid out on the table, the washtubs, the men still sitting or resting in chairs that Marin had pulled from other rooms, Clem in the corner with color coming back into his face, working slowly through a piece of cornbread. Then Boone looked at Marin. She heard him come in, didn't turn right away. "2 outbuildings," he said, so rough voice. "Something underneath the smoke." "Smoke. I know." She turned then. He looked like a man who had been holding himself at a particular tension for several hours and had just received permission to release it. "Clem," he said, "here." Marin nodded toward the corner. "Smoke, no burns, he'll be fine." Boone let out a breath from somewhere deep. The exhale of a man releasing something he hadn't fully registered he was carrying until it was gone. He looked around the kitchen again. At all of it. "Sit down," Marin said. "I'll get you something." "I don't need to, Boone." He sat. She brought coffee and a plate and sat across from him. It was the first time she'd done that. Sat across from him rather than beside or standing or serving. She knew he noticed the difference. She didn't move from the chair. "The outbuildings can be rebuilt," she said. "I know. The herd is safe. The house is standing. The men are here. I know." Rougher. Something working in his voice besides the smoke. "Tonight you'll go through what burned," Marin said. "That's natural. Tomorrow you'll look at what's standing, and it'll be most of it." He looked at her across the table. The lamp was low. Through the window, the horizon still held a faint, thin line of orange that would be gone in an hour, but was there now. A reminder of how close the evening had come to going a different way. "Frank told me," Boone said, "what you were doing in here while we were out there." He said it was the first time all night he stopped being frightened. He paused. "That wasn't the food. That was you." Marin said nothing for a moment. "I was frightened too," she said. "When Ezra went after Clem." "I know," Boone said. "That's what made it what it was. Not that you weren't afraid. That you kept going anyway. Quiet between them. The kind that settles after something true has been said and doesn't need adding to." Then Boone said, in a different register, lower, more deliberate, the tone of a man who has arrived somewhere he's been moving toward for a while. "The 6-week contract ends in 4 days." Marin met his eyes. "I know," she said. "I want you to stay," he said. "Not just the kitchen. The household. Whatever the role needs to be, we write new terms, whatever you need. Permanent if you're willing to consider it." He stopped. Started again. "And I want to be honest with you that it's not only about the ranch." The kitchen was very still. "What is it about then?" Marin said. He picked up his coffee cup. Set it back down. "I've been in this kitchen with you for 6 weeks," he said. "And I'm aware that something is different when you're in the room. I don't have a clean word for it yet. I'm not saying it to put weight on a professional arrangement. I'm saying it because you've been straight with me from the beginning and you deserve the same in return." Marin sat with those words, turned them over the way she turned over things that mattered, carefully, fully, without rushing past the parts that were difficult. She thought about 10 years at Gideon's, about the cornbread she'd carried to the door, about tomato plants putting out fruit in ground too dry to earn them, about the 14 days she'd just run this kitchen like a field operation without stopping once, and what she'd felt underneath all of it. Not performance, not obligation, but something closer to certainty, the particular steadiness of being exactly where you're supposed to be doing exactly what you're supposed to do. She thought about all the reasons not to trust this. She knew the list by heart. 4 more days on the contract, she said. "Marin, let me finish what I started," she said. "Then we have the rest of the conversation." Boone was quiet. 4 days, he said. Outside, the orange had faded from the horizon. The lamp on the table burned steady. From the corner of the room came the soft sound of Clem asleep in his chair, which was somehow exactly right. Marin Callahan and Boone Mercer sat across from each other in the quiet after a dangerous night. Both of them aware that something had shifted in the space between them, something that didn't shift back. Marin stood, began clearing the table. But she was aware, in a way she hadn't been that morning, that she wasn't only clearing the dishes. She was staying. She hadn't said it yet, but she already knew. The letter arrived the morning after the fire. Marin was in the kitchen garden when the rider came. On her knees in the cracked earth, checking the tomato roots she had been watering by hand every evening since her 2nd week at the ranch. The fruit was coming in now, small and hard and green still, but real, growing in ground that by any reasonable measure had no business producing anything. She heard hooves at the front gate. Didn't think much of it. Riders came through on ranch business regularly enough. Then Chester came around the side of the house, holding an envelope. "For you," he said. Which was unusual enough that Marin sat back on her heels and looked at him before she looked at the envelope. Nobody sent Marin letters. Nobody had sent Marin letters in 10 years at Gideon's because nobody thought of her as a person who received correspondence. She was a person who cooked things. Letters were for people with lives that extended beyond the kitchen door. She wiped her hands on her apron, took the envelope. The handwriting was small and precise, controlled. The penmanship of a woman who believed that how you formed your letters said something about how you formed your character, and had spent 4 decades proving she had excellent character by writing very small, very straight, very deliberate lines. Mrs. Gideon. Marin stood in the garden and looked at the envelope for a long moment. Then she tucked it into her apron pocket, went back to the tomatoes, finished checking the remaining plants in the row, stood up, brushed the dirt from her knees, went inside. She read it at the kitchen table, alone, everyone out working, the house quiet around her, the particular quiet of the morning after something dangerous, when the danger is gone but the awareness of it hasn't fully left yet. Mrs. Gideon had heard Marin was at Mercer Ranch. Mrs. Gideon had a proposal. A family called the Aldreds, new to Harrow Creek, money from back east, recently settled in one of the larger houses on the north side of town, was looking for a cook and household manager. Private household, permanent position. The wages named were exactly double what Boone was paying, private room. All meals provided. And then in the last line in the same precise small script, I thought you should know there are other options available to you, given that rancher arrangements can be uncertain. Marin read it twice, set it flat on the table. She understood exactly what it was. Not kindness, Mrs. Gideon had not operated from kindness in the 10 years Marin worked for her, and had no particular reason to start now. This was information, which Mrs. Gideon traded the way other people traded goods, when there was something to gain from the exchange. Someone had told her about Mercer Ranch, about the water dispute, about the fire damage. The fire that had happened less than 12 hours ago, which meant this letter had been arranged before the fire, timed to arrive when the ranch would be at its most visibly vulnerable. Someone had planned the timing of this. The wages were real, though. Double was real. Marin took out her notebook, wrote both numbers side by side, looked at them for a while. She was still looking when Boots came through the back door. Boone stopped when he saw her face, looked at the letter on the table, pulled out the chair across from her, and sat down without being asked or needing to be. Bad news, he said. Not a question. Marin slid the letter across without comment. He read it. His face didn't shift much. But she had been reading his face for 6 weeks, and she could see the thing moving through it. Controlled, careful, working hard to stay that way. He set the letter down. The wages are better, he said, flat, making himself say the true things. Yes. Stable household. Established position in town. Yes. And she's not wrong that ranch arrangements carry uncertainty. He paused. The water case. The fire damage. If Crane wins, this becomes a harder operation. I know all of that, Marin said. He looked at the table, then at her. I'm not going to tell you not to consider it. No, Marin agreed. That wouldn't be fair. But I want to say, he stopped, started again. In 6 weeks, this ranch has changed. Not because of anything I did. What you built here, he said, the supply arrangements, the garden, the way the men work and eat and settle their arguments without it becoming something that lands on my desk. That's yours. I knew when I hired you that I was getting someone capable. I didn't understand what I was actually getting until I'd been watching it for 6 weeks. The kitchen was very still. That's not a business argument, Marin said. No, he said, it isn't. She held his gaze. I have one question, and I need the honest answer. Always. If Crane wins the water case, she said, and the next 2 years are genuinely hard, not uncomfortable hard, actually hard, do you have a plan that survives it? He didn't hesitate. Consolidate the herd to what the Western water can support. Take the market lost this October and don't pretend otherwise. Use what we save on reduced operating costs over winter to shore up the Western wells properly. File the counterclaim aggressively and let Crane spend money sustaining a legal fight while we improve our position. He paused. It's survivable, not comfortable, but survivable. Marin nodded slowly. She looked at the letter on the table. Then she folded it along its original crease and put it back in her apron pocket. I need to think, she said. I'll give you my answer before the contract ends. Boone nodded. He stood, picked up his hat, and then in the quieter register, the one he used when something cost him something to say, whatever you decide, the offer here is real. And if you go to Harrow Creek, he stopped. The tomatoes will be ripe in about 3 weeks. I want you to know that I'll eat every one of them and think about the person who grew them. He walked out. Marin sat in the kitchen for a long moment after his footsteps faded. Then she heard Clem's voice outside, asking Frank where the fence staples were kept, and Frank's voice answering him, and the ordinary working sound of the ranch going on around her like water, around something that simply belongs in the river. She stood up, went back to the next task on her list. Margaret Voss arrived the next day, and she did not come alone. 2 women with her. Dorothea Ainsley, who was in the others and owned land east of the property Crane had acquired, and Ruth Sparrow, who ran the telegraph office in Harrow Creek alongside her husband, and had developed, over years of handling other people's urgent communications, a particular economy with words, and a very accurate sense of when information mattered. Maureen had coffee on the table in 4 minutes, because she always had something ready. Margaret did not spend time on approach. "We've heard about the injunction," she said. "Most people in the county have by now," Marin said. "Silas Crane is not a well-liked man," Margaret said, "but he's a patient one, and he has the specific confidence of someone who has learned that money outlasts if you're willing to wait." She looked at Marin directly. "We also know he's been making inquiries about this household." Marin went still. "What kind of inquiries?" "About staffing," Dorothea said. She had the directness of someone who hadn't yet learned to soften information before delivering it, which Marin found entirely refreshing. He approached Mrs. Gideon about the possibility of, and I'm repeating this exactly as it was told to me, securing the services of Mercer Ranch's household manager, should the ranch's situation become sufficiently difficult. The room was quiet. Marin set her coffee cup down. "He arranged the letter," she said. Margaret nodded once. "Deliberate. Crane understands what a functioning household means to a working ranch under financial and legal pressure," she said. "He knows that without someone managing the interior operations effectively, an operation like this one loses faster than the legal case alone would take it. He wants Mercer Ranch. He's decided the most efficient path is to destabilize it from the inside." Marin sat with this. Let it settle into the shape it actually was. A man who had looked at her and seen a lever, who had calculated her value to this ranch and concluded that removing her was worth the cost of arranging a letter through an intermediary, who had never in any of that calculation thought of her as a person making her own decisions. That was his mistake. "Does Boone know?" she said. "We came to you first," Ruth Sparrow said, speaking for the first time. Careful voice. Precise. "Because you are the one being targeted. We thought you deserved to know before anyone made decisions on your behalf." Marin looked at the 3 women across the table from her. 3 women who had driven out to the ranch and asked for her. Not for Boone, not through Boone. For her. "What do you want from this conversation?" Marin said. Margaret straightened, the manner of a woman who has been waiting for exactly this question and is prepared to answer it. "We want Crane to lose," she said, plainly. "He has been buying land in this county for 4 years by finding people in hard positions and making those positions harder until selling becomes the only exit they can see. He took the Farnsworth property that way, the creek land south of town. He is not going to have Mercer Ranch." "Why does Mercer Ranch matter to you specifically?" "Because if Cranes gets the eastern acreage here, he controls water access for 3 other properties in the county," Dorothea said, "including my family's land." There it was. "So your interests and Boone's are aligned," Marin said. "They are," Margaret said. "And we believe yours are as well, if you're willing to act on that." "What are you proposing?" Margaret leaned forward slightly. "The Harvest Festival is in 2 weeks. Every rancher, merchant, and landowner in this county attends. It is also the occasion of the annual Community Recognition, an award that carries genuine social weight in Harrow Creek, not just ceremony." She paused. "We want to nominate the work done at this ranch during the drought and the fire. The supply trading network, the aid to neighboring households, the fire response that protected not just Mercer property, but 2 adjacent fence lines." Marin looked at her. "You want to make it public. We want to make it impossible to quietly dismantle," Margaret said. "Crane operates in the space where no one is watching. He cannot function in full light. A man cannot slowly suffocate something the entire community is publicly named as valuable to all of them." Marin thought about the trade with Mrs. Dunbar, the sage and the cornmeal, the other ranch wives she'd reached out to in the past month. 4 conversations, 4 small arrangements, each one starting with nothing more than the observation that one household had too much of one fettin' thing and another had too little. She had never thought of it as a network. It was just the next obvious thing to do. She thought about what it meant to be seen publicly, about 10 years of preferring the opposite, about whether she was willing. "All right," she said. "What do you need from me?" What Margaret needed turned out to be considerable. A full accounting of every trade arrangement, every act of practical aid, every solution Marin had put in place since arriving at the ranch. A week of evening work at the kitchen table after supper, organizing the contents of her notebook into something that could be presented to a crowd, which required translating the private language of daily management and in plain specific story that people who weren't living it could understand. Boone found her on the third evening surrounded by papers. "What is all this?" he said. She told him. "All of it." Margaret's visit, Crane's arrangement of the letter, through Mrs. Gideon, the plan for the full. She told him everything that mattered, without softening the parts that were difficult, without waiting to see how he was receiving it, before she'd finished saying it. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, the silence lasted long enough to mean something. "He came after you," Boone said. The quietness in his voice was not the quietness of a calm man. "He used me as a pressure point," Marin said. "He didn't come after me as a person. He saw a variable he could remove. That's the difference between thinking and a plan that would actually have worked." Boone pulled out a chair and sat, looked at the papers on the table. "You should have told me when the letter arrived. I needed to understand the situation fully before I brought it to you," Marin said. "I don't bring you incomplete information. That's not how I operate." He looked at her. "I should have been the first person who knew." "You're not always the first person I tell things," Marin said. "I work problems through myself before I share them. That's not something I'm going to change." "Quiet. Is that going to be a difficulty between us?" he said. "Only if you need it to be different than it is." He sat with that for a moment. "No," he said finally. "I don't suppose I do." He looked at the papers. "What do you need from me for this?" "Your approval," Marin said. "It's your ranch. If you don't want the public attention, we don't pursue it. The decision belongs to you. It's your work they'd be recognizing. It's your land and your name and your legal situation that the outcome affects," she said. "The decision is yours." He met her eyes. "You have my approval. Do what Margaret is asking." He stood, picked up his hat from the table, and Marin. He waited until she looked up from the papers. "When this is over, when the festival is done and Crane is handled and everything immediate is settled, I want to have a real conversation. Not at the end of a long day, not with papers between us." Marin held his gaze. "One thing at a time," she said. He nodded, walked out. She turned back to her papers and did not let herself think about the warmth in her chest for more than a moment before she picked up her pen. Crane came to the ranch himself 3 days before the festival, which was, as it turned out, his first real mistake. Marin was in the garden when she heard the horse at the gate. She came around the side of the house and understood immediately. Expensive gray horse, well-dressed for ranch country in the specific way of a man who wants to signal prosperity without looking like he's trying to. The ease in how he sat the animal. The ease of someone accustomed to arriving places and having that arrival mean something. He saw her. His eyes moved over her with the swift, conclusive efficiency of a man who logs things quickly and rarely revisits his first assessment. "Looking for Boone Mercer," he said. "He's at the south fence line," Marin said pleasantly. "You're welcome to wait on the porch. I'll bring coffee." "And you are?" "Marin Callahan, household manager." Something crossed his face. Recognition briefly, then managed away. "Miss Callahan," he said. "I've heard your name, I imagine you have," Marin said. Same tone, same pleasantness. He studied her for a moment. "You received a letter recently, regarding a position in Harrow Creek." Marin looked at him, not with hostility, not with fear, with the direct, complete attention she gave to things she was taking seriously. The look that left no performance room on either side. "Mr. Crane," she said, "I know who you are. And since you've mentioned the letter, I think you know that I know. Was there something you wanted to say to me plainly?" Crane looked at her, the expression of a man recalibrating. Not accustomed to this particular response, not sure of his footing, but too practiced to show that he'd lost it. "This ranch is going to face difficult years," he said. "The water case will move slowly. The fire damage is real. A woman with your capabilities could secure considerably better circumstances elsewhere." "You may be right," Marin said. "The position in Harrow Creek remains available, even if circumstances here change significantly." "That's generous," she said. She smiled. Porch is just through the gate. I'll let Boone know you're here. She walked away from him, without hurrying, without looking back. She had given him nothing to work with. No argument to answer, visible feeling to it. No crack in the surface where a lever could find purchase. She found Chester at the equipment barn, told him quietly and directly. Chester's jaw tightened. I'll get Boone. Chester. She waited until he looked at her. Whatever happens in that conversation, Boone shouldn't manage it alone. Will you be there? Chester looked at her. You want a witness? I want Crane to remember that more than one person was present, Marin said. Men like him are less certain of themselves when they're outnumbered by people who are paying attention. Chester put on his hat. He did not walk to the south fence line. He moved considerably faster than walking. Marin watched from the kitchen window. She couldn't hear the words, but she could read the shape of the conversation from the posture of the men in it. Boone, contained. The specific contained quality of a man who has made his decision before the conversation started and is simply waiting for it to finish. Crane, confident at the opening. 18 minutes in, something had changed in how he was holding himself. Chester, standing to one side with his arms crossed and his face saying nothing at all, which was its own kind of statement. When Crane rode out, Boone came directly to the kitchen, sat down, said nothing for a moment. Marin poured coffee, sat across from him. He offered to withdraw the injunction, Boone said. She went still. In exchange for what? 300 acres on the eastern boundary. Creek frontage included. Less than he had originally, not the 800. Just the 300 with the water access. Marin looked at him carefully. That's a more measured number than he started with. It's still no. Why? Because in 4 years he's back for the next 300, Boone said. Crane doesn't stop at what he takes first. He stops when there's nothing left to take. He looked at her. My lawyer says the emergency injunction may have actually damaged Crane's standing. It reads as coercion rather than legitimate legal process. The original water rights are likely to hold, so you hold. I hold. Marin looked at her coffee. He spoke to me before Chester reached you, she said. Boone's eyes came up sharp. He told me that her hockey career was genuine and would remain open regardless of what happened here, Marin said. He wanted to make sure I understood I had somewhere to go. If I believed that and went, the ranch would be weaker entering the legal proceedings, and you'd be more susceptible to his terms. Boone was very still. He doesn't know me, Marin said, quietly, without drama. That's the error. He looked at me and saw a piece he could move. He didn't see a person who had already decided where she was. Boone looked at her across the table. Have you, he said, decided. Marin met his eyes. I'm not going to Harrow Creek, she said. I'm not going anywhere. She paused. I'm staying because this is where I want to be, not because the ranch requires it, because I want to be here. The kitchen was entirely quiet. Boone put his hand on the table between them. Open. Flat. Not reaching toward her, just placing it there, visible, the way you set down something you want another person to be able to see clearly. Marin looked at his hand. Then she reached across and covered it with hers, just for a moment. The brief, certain pressure of one person as other something. True in the language that doesn't require words for it. She pulled her hand back, picked up her cup. The festival is in 4 days, she said. I need to finish the accounting for Margaret before then. Boone looked at her with the expression she'd been learning for 6 weeks and still found, when it was aimed at her fully, almost more than she knew how to simply receive. All right, he said. 4 days. The night before the festival, Marin baked cornbread. Not for the festival, not for anyone. The small skillet. The same recipe her hands knew without measuring. The one that smelled like something that had existed before everything in her life contracted to its current size. She was at the stove when Boone came through the kitchen late, finished with the accounts he'd been working through all evening. He stopped in the doorway. The smell reached him before anything else. She heard him stop. Saturday cornbread, Marin said without turning. Old habit. It's Wednesday, he said. I know. Why tonight? She was quiet for a moment, watching the edges of the cornbread go golden. Tomorrow there will be people and noise and public things. Tonight I wanted something that was just mine. He crossed the kitchen, stood beside her at the stove, looking at the skillet the way he looked at things that mattered, without hurrying past them, without needing them to be more than they were. Marin, he said. Boone, she said. I want to say something before tomorrow, before all of it becomes public. He took his time with the words. I noticed you first because of what you did with that cornbread. Not because the act was extraordinary, because of what it told me about the person doing it. He stopped. But what I feel right now has nothing to do with cornbread. It has to do with who's standing next to me. And I wanted you to know that before tomorrow changes things. Marin stood at the stove and felt those words settle into her chest the way true things settle, completely without residue, without anything left over that needs somewhere to go. She turned to look at him. One question, she said, honest answer, always. If I could never cook again, she said. If the kitchen was gone and the skillet was gone and none of this. She gestured at the room, the stove, the garden visible through the dark window, the life she had built in 6 weeks out of cracked earth and surplus cornmeal and 2 full bowls of stew. If none of this was what you first saw, would you still be standing here? Boone looked at her, didn't look away, didn't take time to think about it. Marin, he said, I didn't fall in love with your cornbread. The words settled between them. Not dramatically, with the quiet, irreversible weight of something true being said aloud for the first time. I fell in love, he said, with the woman who gave it away. Marin looked at him for a long moment. 10 years of being the pair of hands that fed other people. The careful distances, the walls she had built and maintained, and told herself were practical. The long habit of not trusting things that felt good, because good things had taught her. They came with expiration dates she didn't get to determine. Yes, she said. He looked at her. Yes, she said again. The way she said things that mattered, without the careful distance, without edging to whatever comes next. Yes. Boone reached out and took her hand. She let him, and held it. Outside the kitchen window, the Texas night was deep and enormous, and the cloud cover had finally the stars that had been there all along, waiting. The morning of the harvest festival was clear and still and blue. Marin was up at 4. She stood at the kitchen window for 5 full minutes before she lit the stove, which was not her habit. She was not by nature a woman who stood. She was a woman who moved from one necessary thing to the next. But this morning she let herself be still. She had things to be still about. She made a full pan of cornbread for breakfast. 14 people to feed in a 2-hour wagon ride ahead. She worked through the familiar motions and let the familiarity do what it always did, which was settle her. The particular comfort of knowing exactly what your hands are doing and why. Clem appeared at 5:15. Stood in the doorway with the uncertain look of someone who hasn't slept enough and isn't sure whether their company is wanted. Couldn't sleep, he said. Come in, coffee's ready. He sat, wrapped both hands around his cup. Both hands, the left one healed clean and solid the way injuries heal in young people who are taken care of properly. He looked at the table with the expression of someone who has something to say and isn't sure of his welcome to say it. Marin slid a piece of warm cornbread in front of him without being asked. Ma'am, Clem said, still looking at the table. Can I say something? You can say whatever you like. When you first got here, he said carefully, some of us weren't sure what to make of things. Having someone new come in and change how the kitchen worked and everything. He stopped, searched for the right words with the effortful honesty of someone for whom the right words don't come easily. I just want you to know it's different now. Not only because the food is better, though it is, but because it feels like someone is keeping account of us, like it matters to somebody whether we're all right. Marin stood at the stove with her back to him. Let that move through her chest, the way true things move when you needed them, and didn't know how much until they arrived. It does matter, she said. It always did. Yes, ma'am, Clem said. I know that now. He ate his cornbread. She finished making breakfast. Neither of them said anything more. It was one of the better conversations she'd had in a long time. Frank Birch appeared in the kitchen doorway. 20 minutes later. A thing he had never done before in 6 weeks. He stood there for a moment without saying anything, hat in his hand, looking at a point somewhere between the floor and Marin's general direction. I heard what Clem said, Frank told her. He said it better than I would have, but he stopped, started again. I was in this kitchen the night of the fire. You didn't ask me if I was all right, you just made sure I was, before I knew what was happening. He turned his hat once in his hands. I don't know that anyone's done that before. For me, he put his hat back on. That's all. He walked out before she could respond. Marin stood at the stove for a moment. Then she turned back to the breakfast and kept moving. because that was what you did with things that mattered, and didn't have words big enough for them. The ride to Harrow Creek took 2 hours on the good road. Boone rode alongside the wagon in his dark vest and his good hat. Not the working ones, the town ones. He looked at Marin when she climbed up to the wagon seat in her green dress, and didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "You look like yourself," which was exactly right, and she was fairly certain he knew it. "Let's go," she said. Harrow Creek on Festival Day was what small towns become once or twice a year when they decide to be their best version of themselves. Every surface swept. Every face turned outward. The specific warmth of people who have spent most of the year dealing separately with their separate hardships and have chosen, for one day, to be something larger than that. Margaret Voss found Marin within 10 minutes of the wagon stopping. "Everything is arranged," she said, in the manner of a woman who has been organizing things since before sunrise and is running on the particular fuel of someone doing something they're very good at. "The recognition is at 2 o'clock. County recorder is here. The newspaper sent someone down from the North County." She paused, looked at Marin directly, and for a moment the efficiency dropped away and something more genuine came through. "Miss Callahan," she said, "I have organized this festival for 9 years. I have arranged more recognitions than I can count. I have never arranged one for someone who had earned it as completely as you have." She straightened. "I wanted you to know that before you had to stand up there." Marin looked at her. "Thank you, Mrs. Voss," she said, genuinely. Silas Crane arrived at the festival at 11 o'clock. Marin saw him before Boone did. The gray horse. The 2 men flanking him. The easy, practiced way he moved through a crowd. Someone who had learned long ago that arriving as though you belong somewhere is halfway actually belonging there. His eyes found her across the street. She held his gaze, pleasant, steady. Not a challenge and not a retreat, simply the look of a woman who knows her position and has no reason to perform uncertainty about it. Crane looked away first. Boone appeared at her shoulder. "He's here, I saw. My lawyer arrived this morning with news about the injunction." Marin turned to look at him. "What news?" "The emergency injunction has been denied," Boone said. "The judge ruled 2 days ago. Crane's filing was found to be procedurally deficient. The new survey evidence wasn't properly authenticated under the terms of the original boundary agreement. The original water rights stand pending full review, which is now unlikely to be expedited." He paused. "He's lost the injunction. His legal position going forward is considerably weaker than it was a month ago." Marin looked across the street to where Crane stood with his men. She watched him the way she watched difficult things, clearly, without flinching, without satisfaction larger than the moment warranted. "He's not finished," she said. "No," Boone agreed, "but he's working with much less than he had yesterday." "That's enough for today," Marin said. At 2 o'clock, the festival noise settled, and Margaret took the platform that had been set up outside the town hall. Marin stood in the crowd between Boone and Chester, and felt the unfamiliar sensation of being the subject of a public moment rather than the person making a public moment possible for someone else. Spoke the way she did everything, with efficiency and precision, and underneath it today something warmer. She described the drought, the fire. She named, specifically and concretely, the supply trading arrangement Marin had built between 8 households in the eastern county, calling it what it was, a practical system that had reduced hardship across the region during the worst weeks of the drought. She described the fire response, the aid to neighboring properties, the steady, unannounced work of a woman who had treated her job as a form of community care without being asked to and without asking for anything back. Marin listened and felt each thing named land, not comfortably, not easily, but without the wrongness she'd half expected. Like being looked at by someone whose looking didn't cost her anything. When Margaret invited her to the platform, Marin walked up with her back straight and her hands at her sides, and stood in front of the gathered people of Harrow Creek. She saw Clem at the edge of the crowd, full-armed enthusiasm, the uncomplicated pride of a young man happy for the people he works alongside. She saw Ezra Hollis with his hat in both hands, watching with the quiet dignity of someone who said what needed saying in a kitchen weeks ago and required nothing more. She saw Frank Birch, arms crossed, eyes bright in the way of a man who doesn't want to be seen being moved and very much is. She saw Mrs. Dunbar, who had driven in from the ranch with her 2 daughters, and who met Marin's eyes and gave a single nod that carried everything the cornmeal trade and the sage and the Sunday soup recipe had meant. She saw Dorothea Ainsley and Ruth Sparrow near the back. She saw Chester Wold, standing to the left of the platform, arms crossed, and on his face, an expression that had traveled a long distance over the past 6 weeks, all the way from carefully managed hostility to something that looked, if she was reading it right, like pride. The unperformed kind. He caught her eye, gave her the real nod. She nodded back and she saw Boone, standing at the edge of the platform with one hand resting on the post, watching her with the expression she had been learning for 6 weeks and still found, when it was aimed at her fully, almost more than she knew how to simply receive. Not complicated, just a man who was exactly where he'd chosen to be. Marin turned to the crowd. "Thank you," she said, into the quiet. She had thought about what she might say, had even written a few lines in her notebook the night before and then crossed them out because they sounded like someone performing gratitude rather than feeling it. So she just said the true things. "I'm not accustomed to being the one at the front of the room." A few people smiled. Someone near the back laughed softly, which helped. Everything described here started with a sack of cornmeal and a good idea for Mrs. Dunbar, who saw the same problem I saw and was willing to act on it. "This belongs to her as much as to me." Mrs. Dunbar pressed her lips together and looked at the ground, which, from a woman of her particular composure, said everything. "What I've done at Mercer Ranch," Marin said, "is what any person does when they understand that their work is connected to the people around them. You don't feed 10 men 3 times a day because it's a job. You feed them because they're working hard in difficult conditions, and they need someone making sure they can keep going. You don't trade cornmeal for salt pork because it's clever. You do it because your neighbor has too much of one thing and not enough of another, and fixing that is simply." She paused. The next word arrived slower than she expected. "Simple. It's just simple, and I don't know why we forget that." She looked out at all of them. "I spent most of my life being quiet about what I do, because nobody asked. Beat. Today someone asked. I'm grateful for it. And I want you to know, every one of you, that you are worth feeding. I hope you already know that, but if you don't, I'm telling you now." The quiet that followed was the kind that doesn't need filling. Then Clem started clapping, all the way from his shoulders, with the complete commitment of someone who has decided this is correct and sees no reason to be restrained about it. The crowd followed. Marin came down from the platform. Boone was at the foot of the steps. He didn't say anything, just placed his hand briefly at the small of her back, the lightest possible contact, the quietest possible acknowledgement, the kind that asks for nothing and means everything. She leaned into it for exactly 1 second. Then they turned back to the crowd together. Crane left before the dancing began. Marin noticed the gray horse moving toward the far end of the street, his men following. The bearing of a man in the process of recalculating, not finished, not defeated, but working with considerably less than he'd arrived with. Rearranging took time, and time, Marin had learned, over 10 years and 6 weeks and 1 Saturday night with a skillet of cornbread, could be used. She turned back to the festival and let him go. The dancing started at 4 when the light had gone gold, and the main street had been cleared, and the musicians, 2 fiddles and a guitar player with strong opinions about timing, took their places. Boone found her at the edge of the food tables. He looked at her, extended his hand, not tentatively. The same open, deliberate gesture you have at Gideon's, across a dining table, to a woman that nobody in that establishment had thought worth the courtesy. Marin looked at his hand. Thought about 10 years of standing on the serving side of every room she'd ever been in. About every time she'd made herself smaller so that no one had to rearrange themselves to accommodate her. About standing in a back doorway, holding a skillet of cornbread, entirely certain no one was watching. She put her hand in his. He was right that he was not a graceful dancer, but he was careful, attentive, making up in attention what he lacked in ease, which was simply how he did everything that mattered to him. Found the rhythm immediately, because she always found rhythms. And between the two of them they made something that wasn't elegant, but was entirely genuine, which was in the end considerably better than elegant. "Marin," Boone said after a while. I've been thinking about what comes after all of this. Every plan I'm working through," he said. Every season, every decision going forward. You're in all of it." He paused. "I want to know if that's something you'd be willing to consider. Permanently. as more than a household arrangement. Marin kept moving with the music. She looked at his face. The honest, careful face of a man who had never performed anything in her presence, who had simply been exactly who he was. From the first morning he sat at the window table and asked a question 10 years of daily service had never once produced. "The hands will talk," she said. "They already are," he said. "Chester told me 3 days ago that Frank told Clem that Ezra said it was past time. Apparently this has been the prevailing opinion for several weeks." Marin laughed, the full kind, from somewhere real. "Ezra," she said. "Ezra," Boone confirmed. She looked at him, the Golden Street, the music, the people choosing for one day to be their better selves. And Marin Callahan stood in the middle of all of it and felt, with the specific clarity of a woman who has spent a long time knowing exactly what she doesn't have, the full weight of what she did. "Yes," she said. He looked at her. "Yes," she said again, the way she said things that mattered. Without the careful distance she'd kept between herself and good things for most of her adult life. Without condition, without reservation. To all of it. Boone's hand tightened around hers. The quiet equivalent of everything he didn't need words for. They danced until the music stopped. In the years that followed, Mercer Ranch became known across the county, not for what it had survived, but for what it had become. The supply trading arrangement Marin had built in that drought year grew to include 13 households by the third year. A practical network that reduced hardship across the eastern county in ways that the people inside it spoke about matter-of-factly, because they were practical people, but which amounted in real terms to the difference between a hard year and a year that broke you. Women who needed work found it at the ranch. Children from harder corners of the county always left with full stomachs. And something wrapped for the road. Marin never made speeches about any of this. She just did it. Because the doing was the point. Every Saturday morning, without exception, she's baked one small skillet of cornbread. Boone asked her about it once. 3 years after they married, on a morning when there was more pressing work and she'd still risen before light to make it. "You have the whole kitchen now," he said. "You could make it any day." "I could," she said. "Then why Saturday?" Marin looked at the skillet. "Because Saturday is when I used to make it when it was the only thing I had," she said. "And I make it on Saturdays now to remember what it felt like to give away the only thing you have and find out the world didn't end." She paused. It opened. Boone put his hand on her shoulder. Brief, steady. The way he communicated everything that didn't need words. Marin turned back to the stove. The cornbread finished baking in the unhurried way of things made with care. Golden at the edges, solid at the center, exactly what it was meant to be. Outside, the kitchen garden was full. The tomatoes were ripe on the vine. The drought had broken 2 seasons ago, and the creek ran clear on the eastern boundary where it had always belonged. And Marin Callahan Mercer stood in the kitchen that was hers, and made the thing her hands had always known how to make. For herself as much as for anyone, which was all she had ever needed, not less, her share. And it had always, from the very beginning, been enough.